We bring in a couple of programs every month. This month we have 3 programs because 2 March programs were snowed out. One is put off until September, and one is going to be here in May. So I'm happy to see such a nice big group, and you're in for a wonderful evening. We've had Steve Puleo here before, and he's a terrific speaker. We're going to also have his books for sale after the talk. I have 15 copies of The Caning and 5 copies each of the paperback Dark Tide and The City So Grand. So you can look at them later. Stephen Puleo is an author, a historian, a university teacher, a public speaker, and a communications professional. In 2008, Steve was the recipient of the Outstanding Achievement Award presented by the Appian Club, an Italian-American organization dedicated to preserving and promoting Italian culture in Massachusetts. In 2007, he received the prestigious E. Migliori Award presented by the Pirandello Lyceum to Italian-Americans who have excelled in their field of endeavor and made important contributions to society. A former award-winning newspaper reporter and contributor of feature stories and book reviews to American History Magazine and the Boston Globe, Mr. Puleo holds a master's degree in history, for which he received the Dean's Award for Academic Achievement and was the graduate convocation keynote speaker. He teaches now at Suffolk University in Boston. Please welcome Steve Puleo.
I'm going to try doing this. This allows me to use my hands when I talk, which I like to do. So I hope can you guys hear me okay? I will project. If for some reason my voice starts to flag, you folks in the back just raise your hand, and I'll make sure that I speak up. So thank you so much. I was thinking, I was over at my mom's house earlier. She lives in Burlington. So I drove here from Burlington to Winchester, and I wondered, are there any Winchester town officials here tonight? Selectmen, whatever? Okay, I need to get a green arrow from 3A onto Church Street. Is there a way you guys could petition that to make that happen? I went through like 6 light changes, so I wasn't sure I was going to get here on time, and I did. So it's great to be here, and like Connie said, I've been here several times before. It's always been a great venue. And thank you so much for turning out on a beautiful night like tonight, when you probably have a ton of other things you could be doing. So it's terrific to be here. We're going to talk about a pretty unbelievable event in American history. That's the caning of United States Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of the U.S. Senate. And one of those events, very provocative, very dramatic, and I believe it is the event that was the no turning back point on the road to the Civil War. So people will say to me, was the caning a cause of the Civil War? Not necessarily. We all know slavery was probably the number 1 cause. There were other causes, sexualism and the like. But for the most part, without the caning, I'm not quite sure the war would have happened, or certainly would have happened as quickly as it did. I think the caning makes the war unavoidable. Even though it's still 5 years from the time of the caning to the attack on Fort Sumter in the beginning of the Civil War, I think it really began that domino effect that made war unavoidable. So that's why I use that term. It's the no turning back point. The caning takes the slavery debate from an intellectual, academic, political debate and turns it into a very visceral, gut-wrenching, emotional debate. It's one of those events in history, and there have been several, that really gets to people very, very deeply. It makes huge changes in the landscape, in the political landscape, in the mindset of America during this time. The very quick bare bones of this, right? This is a 90-second event that happened on May 22nd, 1856. United States abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, is in the Senate chamber, and when he is beaten to within an inch of his life by South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks, shortly after lunchtime on May 26, 1856. That's the event. That's the event we're talking about. We're going to talk about how it got there, and we're going to talk about the effect afterwards, and all of that. But keep in mind, that's the frame that we're talking about, that little frame in the reel of history that made such an impact both north and south, and as I say, made the war unavoidable. I thought the way we would go tonight is I will do a little talk, as usual, and then at the end of this, we'll get to questions and answers. And when we get to Q&A, please know just about everything is on the table. If you want to talk about the king, if you want to talk about books in general, if you want to talk about research, writing, any of that, feel free. Do not be shy. This is never a shy group. I remember from past visits here, and you shouldn't be that tonight. Right? That's really my favorite part when we get to the Q&A. So be ready for that if you would. What's interesting to me when I was doing the research for this book is you have two very, very strong, complex characters. You have Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, an anti-slavery giant, no question about it. Probably the strongest and most unwavering anti-slavery voice in America for probably 20 to 25 years during this period in the 19th century. Not a really nice guy on a personal level. He had a lot of difficulties with his family, a lot of difficulties with his friends, kind of arrogant, kind of condescending. Friends didn't even like to be around him much. Even his good friends could only take him for so long. We all have friends like that, I know, and Sumner was one of those. So really kind of a deep character, complex guy, probably on the right side of the slavery issue, no question about it. But a difficult guy to get along with, and that plays a part in this story. That's why it's quite important. And for Sumner's research, Sumner is a Boston guy through and through, a Harvard guy. I did most of my research here in Boston, so just about all of Sumner's letters are at the Boston Public Library, or Houghton Library at Harvard, or the Mass Historical Society, and he wrote thousands of letters and received thousands of letters. He was a prolific writer. And he is buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. There's a statue at the Public Garden. There's a statue at Harvard. He lived on the backside of Beacon Hill on Hancock Street. So very much kind of the research that took place in the Boston area. So really interesting kind of research and very, very contained in some respects. For Brooks, I had the pleasure of going down to South Carolina to do my research there. I did my research at Columbia, at the University of South Carolina, where the Brooks papers are. Now, Brooks wasn't as prolific as Sumner, but he did write a lot, many letters, and received many letters, particularly after the king. So his papers are pretty complete at USC, as they call it in South Carolina, the other USC. But that was interesting. And then I made my way out to Edgefield, South Carolina, which is Brooks's hometown. Edgefield is in the western part of the state, about a half an hour from Augusta, Georgia, for you Masters fans. Gives you an idea where we're talking about. Brooks was from probably the most pro-slavery district from the most pro-slavery state at the time, South Carolina. So in Edgefield, I was able to go through some of the disposition of Brooks's estate at the county courthouse, all of his, disposition of all his property, including his 85 slaves at the time of his death. I went to his two homes, privately owned homes that have changed very, very little. The owners were wonderful, showed me around his two houses that he owned there at one point. He's buried at the Edgefield Cemetery, very much a product and a son of Edgefield. I was telling my wife, though, one of the bonuses of going south, and sort of one of the fun parts of going south, in addition to the research, was not that they made a little bit of fun of my Boston accent, which they did. Not the Southern hospitality, which was very real, and they welcomed me with open arms, which I appreciated. But I really had my first meal of shrimp and grits in Edgefield, and it was delicious, fantastic. Have been unable to get it up here. If you guys know of a shrimp and grits place around here, let me know. As I said to the owner of the Edgefield Grill, where I had it, the vice versa, of course, is you cannot get good Chinese in Edgefield, South Carolina. So we kind of had a little laugh about that. But my first shrimp and grits, and it was delicious. So the research for both of these folks, the main characters in this book, and there's lots of characters in this story and in this book, but the two main characters, fascinating kind of characters. So that's, I think, one important thing to share with you. The other thing is, I think when you look at what was going on in the 1850s, and particularly in 1856, which is the year we're talking about, it gives us a whole new definition of partisanship and polarization and, sort of this gulf in Congress. And so today we hear a lot about, oh, is this the most partisan we've ever been? Is this the most polarized we've ever been? It has to be. You get a lot of evers and evers here. And the answer is, of course, no. I think it's very, very clear that the most partisan decade in American history was the 1850s. No question about it. I don't think it's even close. And it really helps you kind of put these issues in perspective. So the issues we deal with today, the partisan issues that we deal with today are things like, who pays what taxes and how much, and what do we do about illegal immigration? How do we fund health care? All important issues, and I don't mean to downplay the importance of the issues. But you need to remember what the debate was about in the 1850s. The debate in the 1850s were questions like this. Should one man be able to own another? Right? Should one man be able to sell a husband to one buyer, his wife to another buyer, and their children to a third buyer? Right? Those are the issues that we were talking about. Were blacks people or property? These very legitimate discussions in Congress as to whether blacks were people or property. Those are the kind of issues we were dealing with in the 1850s. So it's good. I think it helps us keep it in perspective. For me, when I was doing the research, it kind of made the issues we have today seem a little more manageable. I think that was one of the things. Now, maybe I'm looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, but it seemed like they'd be a little bit more manageable after what we went through in the 1850s. And so I think to understand the caning and to understand everything that happened around the caning, it's important to look at that decade, the 1850s. What changed in the 1850s? America had been compromising on the issue of slavery since her founding, quite literally since her founding. Thomas Jefferson's original draft, the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, contains anti-slavery language that was ultimately pulled during discussions. During the discussion of the Constitution in 1787, right? Lots of talk about slavery in Philadelphia, but nothing about slavery makes it into the United States Constitution because of a compromise. Real concerns that the Virginians would not support the Constitution, that the South Carolinians would not support the Constitutions, that the Georgians wouldn't support the Constitution if slavery were in there in a negative way, if some anti-slavery language was in there. And as a result, nothing in the Constitution about slavery, not till the 13th Amendment, that abolishes slavery. So that was a compromise. There were little compromises for several years after that. And then in 1820, we had this gargantuan, convoluted compromise called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. You guys remember that? By the way, there's going to be a number of things I talk about here today that you used to go home and say to your parents, why do I need to know this? You do need to know it, so you're going to know it. And the Missouri Compromise of 1820 is one of those. A real convoluted compromise by Congress on the slavery issue that basically went like this. Congress decides when Missouri comes into the Union, that everything beneath the famous 3630 parallel, remember that? The 3630 parallel, everything south of that, slavery would be permitted. Everything north of that, slavery would be prohibited, except in one state, Missouri, which is almost entirely north of the 3630 parallel. And so the other part of that in 1820 is Congress decided, okay, let's take a big chunk of the state of Massachusetts and create a new free state to continue to preserve that balance, and that free state would be called Maine. Exactly. And so this is kind of this odd compromise and a fragile truce and all of that, but it worked. And so we compromised further on slavery. In the 30s and 40s, 1830s, 1840s, right? We had the three great compromise senators play a role in helping guide the nation through this fragile truce. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, Henry Clay of Kentucky, the great compromiser, and of course from Massachusetts, you guys tell me who it is. Daniel Webster. Excellent. Who wants to come up here and do this presentation? Outstanding. Daniel Webster, the compromiser, the great compromiser. And they guided us through that period. But things change in the 1850s. Why is that? I think there are two big, gigantic changes in the 1850s that changed the debate. Pre-caning, this is pre-caning. One is another kind of convoluted compromise that takes place in 1850, called very creatively the Compromise of 1850. Pretty interesting compromise, and it comes about in these weird connections of history, and there are many strange connections in history. It comes about almost exclusively because gold is discovered in California. You're allowed to say, huh? Yeah, right. So gold is discovered in California. Thousands of people go out to California in the gold rush. California is populated very, very quickly, and they essentially skip the territory stage and want to apply for statehood very, very quickly. So in late 1849, they apply for statehood. They apply as a free state. There's only one problem at the time. There are 30 states in the Union, 15 free, 15 slave. California, coming in as a free state, is going to disrupt that balance. The South, very fearful. If California comes in as a free state, not only will the balance of power in Congress be changed, certainly it would, but the sort of momentum for slavery would slow down, and maybe this would be the beginning of the end of slavery. And so they demand something in return. What they demand in return is part of the Compromise of 1850. The most important part of the Compromise of 1850 is a very stringent, very restrictive fugitive slave law. And the fugitive slave law says this, that if you were an escaped runaway slave from the South, in the past, when you made it to the North, you made it to free states, you were a free man or a free woman. Mostly men, but some women did escape as well. You were free. The new fugitive slave law said this: if you made it to the North and slave hunters came and chased you, came after you, that the northern municipalities, police force, court apparatus, the sort of legal structure of the municipality, city, state, county, whatever, was required to help slave hunters bring that slave back to bondage. Very, very, very important piece of American history was this fugitive slave law. And it manifests itself in its most public way in 1851, when Boston sends her first fugitive slave back to bondage. His name was Thomas Sims. He was an escaped slave from Georgia, Savannah. He makes his way to Boston. Slave hunters come here. The Boston police and the Boston marshal help capture him. He has a very quick court hearing, which is part of the fugitive slave law, and he is sent back to Savannah by ship, back into slavery. It was an embarrassing, humiliating moment for the abolitionists in Boston. Boston had a very active abolitionist movement at the time. This was a terrible moment for them, that Boston, the birthplace of liberty, the cradle of liberty and independence, sends Thomas Sims back to bondage. And they became more enraged and more humiliated and more embarrassed when word came back from Georgia a week later that Thomas Sims received 39 lashes on his bare back in the town square of Savannah, which was the penalty for running away. Big moment. And so for the abolitionists, what it does in Boston and across the North, but particularly in Boston, is it changes the nature of the abolitionist movement in Boston. Up till that point, the abolitionist movement in Boston was largely a speech-making and writing movement. In fact, a couple of the more militant abolitionists, like Thomas Wentworth Higginson, used to get upset at guys like Garrison and Theodore Parker and the like, feeling they were speech makers and they didn't take a lot of action. Well, the Sims case changes all that. And over the next 10 years, right up until the war, Boston abolitionists helped more than 300 runaway slaves escape in a very militant way. And they do it with transportation, with hiding places, with money, with food, with alibis, you name it. And they do it in a very, very active way. The abolitionist movements in Boston and around the North, New York, Providence, Pennsylvania, all had strong abolitionist movements, was energized by the fugitive slave law, and it begins really with the Sims return. But that repeated itself in several states. And so that energized the abolitionists. The other thing the fugitive slave law does is it makes the non-abolitionists in the North, and they were the majority at 1851 by far, the majority, it makes the non-abolitionists in the North a little uncomfortable. Now, these are folks in the North and in Boston who did lots of business with the South. Some of the many Bostonians who got rich in the textile trade from mills just about half an hour from here now, Lowell, Lawrence, and the like. Those folks used as their raw material, their main raw material, almost exclusively cotton that was picked by slaves. And so they got very, very rich on the backs of slavery. They did lots of business with the South. Even those moderates and those conservatives, as they were known at the time, were a little uneasy with this fugitive slave law, a little queasy. It made them uncomfortable sending black men and women who had escaped back into slavery. And so that is one big fundamental shift that happens in the early 1850s. The other big one, the other big pre-Caney one that I like to mention that I think is so important is one of those other events you learned about in high school, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Remember it? You guys all know what it was, right? So I'll just skip right over it. You can recite it. Listen, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, very, very critical act in American history. The architect of that act was a Northern Democrat from Illinois by the name of Stephen Douglas, one of the big names in this period. And basically, Stephen Douglas says this, puts forth an act that Congress approves that basically says this. Let's put that Missouri Compromise aside on these other two territories that are trying to come into the Union, Kansas and Nebraska, and which are both above that 3630 parallel. And instead, let's let the residents of Kansas and Nebraska vote as to whether slavery would be legal. He calls this very fancy term popular sovereignty. And he says, how about we put that forward? Congress passes that Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, here's the issue. Not a real big kind of issue in Nebraska. Nebraska is a little bit too far north for slavery to be economically viable. But in Kansas, certainly economically viable, if not for cotton, then for things like hemp and indigo and some other crops, rice, those kinds of things could grow in Kansas. And so Kansas becomes sort of the centerpiece of the debate over slavery. Now, Stephen Douglas does this for a couple of reasons. Number one, he has eyes on the presidency, and he believes he's going to need Southern Democratic support for the presidency. I think he's right about that, and so he wants to sort of throw a bone to the South here. And two, there's lots of talk about a transcontinental railroad crossing the United States. Now, we're still a decade or so from that, but a lot of talk about the transcontinental railroad. Stephen Douglas wanted the eastern terminus of that railroad to be Chicago, his home state. Most of the South wanted it in St. Louis, Missouri. And so, again, Douglas is kind of throwing a bone to the South. Now, he misjudges how the North is going to react. The North howls in protest over the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the popular sovereignty movement. Howls. Stephen Douglas is burned in effigy in many rallies across the North. In fact, Douglas himself said he believed he could find his way home from his office in Washington to his home in Illinois at night by the light of his own burning effigies. I thought, today that's called high unfavorability ratings. But Douglas is a pretty self-aware guy. He kind of knew it. And so here's the issue. The North's upset about this. The South pleased because the South believes they can send enough people to Kansas to quite literally stuff the ballot boxes. So they can send them over the border from Missouri, those so-called, they later became border ruffians as they were known, Missouri, that slave state. And the South had a concerted effort to send people to Kansas. In Mississippi and Alabama, ladies sold their jewelry to fund expeditions to Kansas. In South Carolina, the state of South Carolina offered $200 to anyone who would go to Kansas to populate Kansas and have this series of elections. And there were a series of elections in Kansas. Kansas became the centerpiece for violence and mayhem and murder and all kinds of riots between pro-slavery and anti-slavery folks. A series of elections. My favorite election story on this stuffing the ballot box idea was in one region. They had an election in Kansas, and there were 1,500 registered voters and 6,000 ballots cast. Perfect. So there's this huge battle going on in Kansas. Keep this in mind, that the center of the slavery debate in 1855 and 1856 was not Massachusetts, was not South Carolina, was not even Washington, D.C. It was the geographic center of the North American continent. Kansas was the huge place that everybody had their eyes towards. And so Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, now think about this, Charles Sumner is first elected in 1851 from Massachusetts, right after the Thomas Sims case. He's an abolitionist. Now, senators aren't elected by the popular vote until 1913. They are elected, in this case, by the state legislature. And the Mass legislature can't agree on who to elect. They ultimately elect Charles Sumner on the 26th ballot, very controversial election. So he takes office, and most people think that he even lasted that long because of the Sims case, that Sims case actually helps Sumner first get elected. So now in early 1856, during this whole Kansas debate, Sumner is down there chomping at the bit to give a speech on the Kansas situation. He wants to give a major anti-slavery speech on Kansas. And he's dying for the floor. He is not allowed the floor in January, February, March. He finally gets the okay to give this major speech in May of 1856. And on May 19th and May 20th of 1856, Charles Sumner delivers a 5-hour speech, 3 hours one day, 2 hours the next, called The Crime Against Kansas. Now, this is a major spectacle. The galleries are filled to overflowing. Sumner is a great orator. Everyone wants to hear what he has to say. Even the ladies' galleries were filled to overflowing, a couple of newspaper reporters noted, which is very, very unusual in the Senate chamber. And Sumner loves the limelight. He loves the spotlight. He enjoyed the big stage, always did, as a speaker, and even as a writer, but particularly as a speaker. And Sumner delivers his speech, and if he had mostly stuck with the issue of slavery and the issue of Kansas and the crime against Kansas, we might not be having this discussion today. But he doesn't. He really can't help himself. Charles Sumner liked to use personal insult and personal invective in his speeches. He did it numerous times, felt it was good for impact, felt it was good for sort of the overall tone of the speech, that people would pay more attention. And in this particular speech, he trains his kind of personal invective on the United States Senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler. Now, Andrew, he uses Butler as the example because he's from South Carolina, the most ardent pro-slavery state. And so Sumner talks about Butler. Butler had recently had a stroke, and a bit of his face was paralyzed. He had a difficult time speaking. He sort of spit when he talked as a result of it. Sumner made fun of that speech impediment that he had. And later in the speech, Charles Sumner says that Andrew Butler took a mistress who was polluted in the eyes of the rest of us, but lovely and chaste. In his eyes, I am talking about the harlot slavery. So he uses that image of a harlot, a prostitute, etc. The northern colleagues of Sumner are angry at Sumner for resorting to this kind of language. William Seward of New York and his wife urged Sumner prior to the speech to take out the personal parts of the speech, because Sumner rehearsed the speech in front of them, not unusual for that time. But he wouldn't take it out. The rest of his northern colleagues very upset at Sumner's language. Stephen Douglas in the back of the room said, "That damned fool is going to get himself killed by another damned fool." That's Douglas's assessment during the speech. The South, of course, totally angry and outraged at Sumner's choice of language and his attack on Butler, who, by the way, wasn't even in the chamber, home recovering from that stroke. He had sort of a relapse, if you will. And one person from South Carolina, congressman who had made his way over to the Senate side during the speech, Preston Brooks, is particularly upset. Now, Brooks is upset for two reasons. One, he's from the same state as Andrew Butler, but two, And more importantly, he is Andrew Butler's second cousin. They are kin. They are relatives. And so Preston Brooks feels the need under the Southern Code of Honor, which he is bound by, which I talk a lot about in the book, he feels the need to avenge Andrew Butler's honor against Sumner. Now, he tries to figure out how to do it. So late in the day on May 20th and into May 21st, he has several discussions with his Southern colleagues on what to do. First, they think about the possibility of challenging Sumner to a duel. But the feeling among these folks is that duels are only ways that gentlemen settle their differences. And Sumner was not a gentleman. He did not rise to the level of gentleman. So dueling was dismissed. The other possibility, Brooks said, and some of his colleagues said, was literally to challenge Charles Sumner to step outside, and we'll settle this like men with fisticuffs. But the feeling was Sumner had a level of arrogance that would not permit him to do that. He would simply tell Brooks, if you want to talk to me, come to my desk. And so they dismissed that idea. And finally, on May 22nd, that next day, Brooks has been seething for 2 days now. That next day, Preston Brooks, at a little after noon, walks into the Senate chamber. Now, the House has adjourned for the day, and the Senate has adjourned for the day. So Brooks comes into the chamber with a couple of his colleagues from the South, one congressman from South Carolina, one congressman from Virginia. He walks into the Senate chamber. He sees Charles Sumner at the front of the chamber, seated at his desk, underneath his legs underneath the desk. Sumner's head is down. He is signing, quite literally, copies of the Crime Against Kansas speech, which would be going to his constituents. He was franking them, as the term went, in the day, and even today. There are a number of people milling about the Senate chamber. Brooks comes in. He's holding a wooden gutta-percha cane in his hand with a gold knob at the end, and he sits down. He sits down in the Senate chamber because there is a lady present. There is a lady in the chamber talking to the Sergeant at Arms. Brooks does not feel like he can take action when a lady is present. The lady talks for about another 10 minutes with the Sergeant of Arms, then leaves the Senate chamber. And Preston Brooks slowly gets up and begins to walk down the aisle towards Sumner. Now, Sumner's at a desk, and this desk, keep in mind, this desk was one of those old-fashioned desks that is literally bolted to the floor. It is bolted to the floor. Sumner's a big guy. He's got his legs underneath the desk. His head is still down. Brooks walks up to him and begins to speak and raise his cane almost simultaneously. He says, "Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech over twice. It is a libel against my state and my relative." And as he's speaking, Sumner looks up, and as he finishes speaking, Preston Brooks slams his cane down on Charles Sumner, the top of Charles Sumner's head. Sumner explodes in blood. His head explodes in blood almost immediately. And with that, Preston Brooks, who said he never wanted to kill Charles Sumner, loses it. Just loses it. It begins to beat Sumner again and again and again. Sumner is kind of still trapped under the desk, forgets to roll his chair back, and is kind of helpless there for a few minutes until finally Sumner, with like a roar, literally wrenches the desk from its moorings. Wrenches it up from its moorings, kind of topples a little bit. Brooks continues to chase him and beat him. He falls against another desk. Brooks grabs him by the lapel and beats him senseless, beats him until he is unconscious in his own blood. Brooks's cane has shattered into pieces. He's only holding the gold knob. At one point during this beating, a newspaperman from New York tried to help Sumner, but he was kept back by one of Brooks's colleagues. But no other senators in that chamber come to Sumner's aid. It's part of the personal difficulties that Sumner had. He had no real true friends in the Senate. Very important point during this. Finally, with Sumner unconscious, covered in his own blood, Brooks's cane completely shattered, Brooks's colleague comes up, grabs Brooks by the arm and says, "Do not kill him," and pulls him away. Charles Sumner is taken to the anteroom next door where his wounds are cleaned. A doctor visits him and kind of stitches them up in a very cursory way. He's then taken to his lodgings in Washington, D.C., where he slips into unconsciousness again. And he says, just before he does, "I can't believe such a thing was possible." And he is unconscious. Charles Sumner, we'll talk a little bit about his long absence from the Senate as a result of the beating, 3 years, with brain trauma and spinal injuries and back injuries, etc. But the news of the caning sweeps America quite literally the next day like a brush fire. There are 3,000 newspapers in America at this time. Almost everybody reads a newspaper, and almost every single one of them lead with the story of the caning. And right away, the domino effect of the caning begins. There's an abolitionist out in Kansas by the name of John Brown. Remember him? John Brown is out in Kansas. And he's out there preaching the anti-slavery message to Kansas. When he gets word by telegraph of Sumner's beating, of Sumner's caning. Now keep in mind, 10, 12 years earlier, there was no telegraph. He wouldn't have had it so quickly. But he does. He gets word of it. And he and his sons go on a rampage. When they find out about the caning, his son said John Brown went crazy when he read about Sumner's beating. And he and his sons murder 5 pro-slavery men in Kansas in very gruesome ways. It's a slaughter. They pull men out of their homes at night. And John Brown, the mad abolitionist, is born as a direct result of the caning out in Kansas in May of 1856. So keep that in mind. John Brown forever changes the way the South looks at abolitionists. They now look at them not as speech makers, not as reasonable men who hate slavery and want to destroy the Southern way of life, but as violent, crazy people for the most part. And so that is a very important part of the caning almost immediately. But even more importantly, in this domino effect, is during the summer of 1856 and the early fall of 1856, so in that 3-4 months after the caning. Thousands and thousands of Northerners, many of them these moderates and these conservatives that I had talked about earlier, thousands of them join the newly formed anti-slavery Republican Party. A party that was only about 18 months old, that in many northern states didn't even exist a year or 9 months earlier. Thousands of them join the Republican Party. They make such an impact in the Republican Party that in the very first candidate the Republicans run for president in 1856, John C. Fremont, nearly wins the presidency. Now he loses to James Buchanan because John C. Fremont, who did not receive a single Southern vote, loses 5 northern states, and so he loses the presidency. But the South sees very, very quickly the harbinger of things to come. They see this, that a unified North could elect a president of the United States without a single Southern electoral vote. That, of course, happens 4 years later in 1860, in probably the most historic election in American history, when Abraham Lincoln is elected. That becomes clear in 1856 to the South. That's a very important byproduct of the caning. So important that many of Sumner's colleagues, many of his Republican colleagues, his anti-slavery colleagues, his abolitionist colleagues, urged him not to hurry back, not to try to get back to work too quickly, because as one of his friends said, your vacant chair speaks even more eloquently than you. Very much a political calculation on the part of the Republicans in the anti-slavery group to leave Sumner out of it. That vacant chair spoke volumes. And it's really interesting when you look at some of the letters. Here's Sumner saying, I can't wait to get back. I'm trying so hard to get back to work. I miss all the debate in Washington. And you have many of his friends saying, don't rush it. Don't rush it. I understand where you're coming from, but take it easy. Make sure you're fully healed, etc., etc. So very, very kind of important political calculation is going on here. And oh, by the way, during the same period, the Republicans distribute about 1 million copies of Sumner's Crime Against Kansas speech around the North in their effort to grow their membership. So very, very important, almost immediate feedback on the caning. And this continues into after the election in 1856. The Republican Party still grows. And in 1857, in January of 1857, Charles Sumner stands for re-election as a senator in Massachusetts. And guess what? He is elected on the first ballot by the legislature unanimously. So quite a difference from 1851, 26th ballot, lots of contention. Sumner is elected unanimously. The South sees that. That is a huge symbolic moment in the South to see that Massachusetts has now almost become completely abolitionist. Not totally. There are definitely pockets who are not, but it's a big change in the legislature of Massachusetts. And then late in January of 1857, one of the most stunning episodes of this entire story, and unexpected episodes of this entire story happens. Preston Brooks, the 37-year-old congressman from South Carolina, dies suddenly of a throat infection in Washington, D.C. He is surrounded by several of his colleagues, all of whom wrote back to his widow these amazing letters talking about how he died, how he suffered with his throat infection. But when he dies, Preston Brooks's iconic status grows. Now, he had this huge iconic status in the summer of 1856 while the Republicans were enlisting membership in the North. Preston Brooks's Southern colleagues and Southern residents were feeding him as a hero. Brooks received hundreds of canes as gifts from Southern voters, many of them inscribed with the words, "Hit him again." The Edgefield Advertiser, the lead newspaper's lead editorial, was called "Hit Him Again." There was a huge outpouring of affection for Preston Brooks. He was an icon during the summer of 1856 and the fall of 1856. Huge icon. In fact, people in the North said that had the South condemned Brooks, that perhaps the North could have viewed that as one Southern congressman who was a hothead, kind of losing his temper. But the Southern response to Brooks, while the North was outraged at Sumner's beating, the Southern response to Brooks kind of changed that dynamic and again increased that gulf between North and South. Well, when Brooks dies in 1857, he dies in D.C. It's a freezing cold January in D.C. There's a blizzard. But it doesn't stop a huge funeral from taking place. Supreme Court attends, Congressman attends, President Buchanan attends, senators attend. Huge, huge funeral in D.C. And even more remarkable, 26 men from Edgefield, South Carolina, make their way to Washington, D.C. in the winter to take Preston Brooks's body back to South Carolina. And they take him back via stagecoach, via train, via horseback. And along the way, thousands and thousands of Southerners come out to pay homage to Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks, make no mistake about it, Preston Brooks, for that 8-month period from May of 1856 to late January of 1857, was as big in the South as John C. Calhoun was before him and as Robert E. Lee would be after him. Now, he didn't have the staying power of either one of those two guys, historically speaking. But in the moment, he was a huge, iconic figure in the South. And this remarkable pilgrimage, which the North is watching, again, sort of makes that gulf wider and wider. And then the dominoes begin to fall quickly, and I think all of them as a result of the environment that caning has produced. In March of 1857, the Supreme Court makes one of its most controversial decisions in its history, often called the most overturned decision in Supreme Court history. It is written by Southern sympathizer, Chief Justice Roger Taney, and it is the Dred Scott decision. You guys know the Dred Scott decision, right? You remember that when you came home and said, "Why do I need to know this?" So the Dred Scott decision, Roger Taney's decision, and again, a friend of Brooks, a Southern sympathizer, the Dred Scott decision said a number of different things. It was actually very confusing when it first came out, but a number of different things. But probably the two most important for our purposes today. Number one, that blacks could not be citizens of the United States. Number one, very important. And number two, probably the most controversial, that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in any state, that the Missouri Compromise was completely unconstitutional since citizens of the United States had a right to life, liberty, and property, and their slaves were their property. Congress had no right to prohibit slavery. Forget that 3630 parallel. If a state wanted to have slavery, if Michigan wanted to have slavery, it would be okay to have slavery under Dred Scott. In fact, Abraham Lincoln says, we could wake up one day and have Illinois be a slave state. And so it is a hugely controversial decision. Roger Taney, I think, does this for a couple of reasons, and one of them is intensely personal. His wife and daughter both die of yellow fever on the same day during his deliberations of Dred Scott. He, I think, sees most of his world crumbling around him. He sees his personal life turned upside down and crumbling around him. He sees abolitionists trying to destroy his Southern way of life. He comes right after the Brooks death in this sort of major symbolic pilgrimage of Brooks. I think Roger Taney writes this opinion. He kind of loses his judicial impartiality for sure writing the Dred Scott decision. So again, the North howls in protest. The South very pleased with the Dred Scott decision, as you might expect. In 1858, there are the very, very famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? For the senatorship in Illinois. They have these 7 3-hour debates. Tens of thousands of Illinois residents come out, even in the pouring rain, to see these debates. And Abraham Lincoln, many times during these debates, talks about Preston Brooks's caning of Sumner. Preston Brooks is dead now for over a year, but he talks about Preston Brooks's caning of Sumner and basically says that if the South is made up of individuals like Preston Brooks, then maybe it's going to be very difficult to reason with them on the issue of slavery. It's a huge, again, a huge debating tactic of Lincoln to bring up the Preston Brooks caning. In 1859, that mad abolitionist John Brown makes his way to Massachusetts. Comes to Massachusetts to raise money. He wants to raise $30,000, and he does, by the way. He raises $30,000 for a very specific task. And his task, what he wants to do, is he wants to raid the arsenal, the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, later would become West Virginia, to spark a slave uprising, to ignite a slave uprising. He comes to Boston, he meets with many abolitionists, the so-called Secret Six, including Thomas Wentworth Higginson and others, fund this exercise. But before he leaves Boston to go down to Harper's Ferry, he meets with Charles Sumner in his apartment. Charles Sumner says to him, "Would you like to see the jacket I was wearing when I was beaten? The blood still remains on it." And John Brown says, "Of course I would." And they go to the closet, and Brown touches Sumner's garment and says later, "It was as though I was touching the hem of the garment of a martyr." Sumner was very big in this martyr piece, and John Brown was too. And he gets inspired. He gets inspired when he touches Sumner's coat. He goes to, of course, Harper's Ferry. It's a miserable failure, the raid on Harper's Ferry. He's captured and he is hanged, but he becomes a martyr in the North in late 1859. The North looks at John Brown as, in many ways, a hero as a result of his efforts. And then, of course, Charles Sumner, who is absent for over 3 years from the Senate, tries to get back. I think he has a combination of brain trauma. I think he has a combination of spinal injuries and back injuries. And I think he has some post-traumatic stress syndrome as well. There are points later in his convalescence when the closer he gets to Washington, the more pain he is in. No question about it. He goes to Europe to try to recover. He undergoes these excruciatingly painful treatments. A French surgeon has developed this treatment where he believes if you use an open flame on a person's back, on his spinal cord, it will alleviate pressure in the spinal cord. Sumner undergoes these excruciating open flame treatments, and he writes about it extensively, saying, I realize I have all these boils and suppurations on my back, but I feel like I'm getting better. Really kind of amazing treatments. He finally comes back. He finally comes back into the Senate in June of 1860. June of 1860. People were wondering, he's going to get up and give a speech. People were wondering, would he have the same fire? Would he give quarter? Would he be a lot more mellow? No. He was as fiery as ever. He gives a speech called The Barbarism of Slavery. And it happens to be the last, fittingly I think, the last major anti-slavery speech in American history, June of 1860. There are none in Congress in the summer of 1860. Abraham Lincoln is elected in November of 1860, and right after Abraham Lincoln is elected, 2.5, 3 weeks later, the South begins to secede, led by who? South Carolina. Preston Brooks's South Carolina goes first. The rest of the southern states followed suit. Charles Sumner, fittingly enough, gives the last anti-slavery speech in American history, for all intents and purposes. Fort Sumter, of course, is attacked in 1861 when Lincoln tries to restock it, resupply it, and the Civil War is underway. My book, The Caning, ends with the beginning of the Civil War. A couple other points, and then I'll open it up to your questions. Charles Sumner, very, very influential senator throughout the Civil War and throughout Reconstruction. He is of the harsh Reconstruction mentality. He was not of the Abraham Lincoln malice toward none mentality. He was very, very instrumental in helping pass the 3 so-called Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which made the children of slaves that were born here citizens of the United States, and the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote. 3 very important so-called Reconstruction Amendments. When he dies in 1874, 18 years after the caning, he dies. His body lies in state at the State House in Boston. 50,000 people file by to pay tribute to Charles Sumner. And I think in a testament of how far the country had come in those 18 years, the state of South Carolina in Columbia lowers its flag to have staff in Sumner's tribute. Now, it was a Reconstruction government down there, so that was a big part of that, but there's no doubt, even with that the sentiments in South Carolina, in the South in general, had changed a little bit towards Charles Sumner. 2 other points. Here's the question. Would the Civil War have occurred without the caning, right? That's the tantalizing question, I think, that this episode kind of presents. So my feeling is you'll never know the answer for sure, but I think almost certainly not as soon as it did. Even though it was 5 years, I think those dominoes would not have fallen as quickly, and that despite the Fugitive Slave Law and despite Kansas, Nebraska, there may have been room for compromise. There may have been room and time to compromise. There is a school of thought among some historians that slavery would have died its own death in the mid-1880s, late 1880s, due to the Industrial Revolution, a little bit more technology, synthetic fibers that replaced cotton and didn't make cotton economically viable anymore. And I think that probably is true. I think I sort of fall into that school of thought. Now, the question is, would there have been a 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendment without the Civil War? Probably not. And probably certainly not as quickly. So, interesting kind of questions to contemplate. Last point, which I found amazingly interesting during my research. All of the stereotypes that Northerners have of Southerners today and that Southerners have of Northerners today can be traced back not just to the 1850s, but I think to this incident, this caning incident. So, the Northern stereotype, and dare I say the Northeast stereotype, and dare I say the Massachusetts stereotype, that Southerners are rednecks and barbarians and don't quite get it and uneducated. Exactly the arguments the North was making about Preston Brooks in 1856. And the Southern arguments that Northerners, and dare I say Northeasterners, and dare I say Massachusetts people, are arrogant, condescending, impolite, impatient, almost exactly the same arguments that the South was making about Sumner and his Massachusetts brethren in 1856. I find it kind of interesting. I think it's always when you know where the stereotypes come from. I don't know if you can overcome them, but at least you can kind of understand them and manage them. So like all good history, I think, like all good episodes in history, the caning, that 92nd episode in 1856, profoundly impacted the country on its road to Civil War and is still impacting the country today. So I am taking a drink of water. Thank you very much. Okay, so when we do questions, I will repeat the questions. So You don't have to strain. If I can hear it, I will make sure everybody can hear it. Sir, in the back, you had your hand up first. Go.
It's a twofold question.
Okay.
When slaves escaped, was there areas in the country that weren't states where they could go and not be hunted or sort of free on their own? Or
So that's part one. What's the twofold?
what would happen if they did get there?
Okay, so the question is, were there areas in the country that weren't states yet, that were territories, or maybe just wild frontier, right? Where slaves could go that they might not be chased? Sure, in some cases, but very often the plantation owners were aggressive in going after their slaves for a couple of reasons. Number one, they were very valuable. They were very valuable pieces of property. If you look at Preston Brooks's list of slaves, you would see an adult male, Toby, valued at $1,850, which is about 3 or 4 times what he would value a wagon. So, number one, they're very valuable. Number two, there were examples to be set for runaways. So, more often than not, plantation owners would send slave hunters whenever they could. So, does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, how come Preston Brooks wasn't arrested for assault, right? Which is a great question. And when I do these presentations, right, I can't include everything in the presentation, so I hope I get it during the question, and I got it. So he was arrested for assault. Preston Brooks was arrested for assault. His sentence was $500, and his Southern colleagues did pay that $500. They raised the money for him. And there were hearings in the House on Preston Brooks's expulsion. Fascinating hearings. The debates were great on his expulsion. Now, you needed a 2/3 vote to expel. And they could not get that. They got a majority vote to expel, but not a 2/3 majority to expel. Preston Brooks, a very proud guy, resigns his seat after the majority vote and stands for re-election in the special election from Edgefield 3 weeks later, in which he wins unanimously, and 2 weeks later takes the oath of office in Congress again. So that was that cycle. So yes, he was arrested for assault. Yes, sir.
How come we don't hear about this in high school?
How come we don't hear about this in high school?
Yes, I didn't.
Listen, how much time you got? I mean, I can go on and on about high school.
30 seconds is fine.
So I'll tell you this, and let me maybe tell an anecdote. Actually, does anyone mind if I take my jacket off? I'm totally dehydrated. No. No, that's fine. I don't normally do that, but it seems kind of hot. So I'll tell you an anecdote. I had a session with several high school textbook publishers one day. Houghton Mifflin, McDougal Littell. There's 3 or 4 big textbook publishers. I can't remember the other 2. And they asked me to take a look at these teacher textbooks and these student textbooks and to give my assessment of what I thought. History textbooks for high school. And I said, sure, I'll do that. And I went through them very diligently and all that. So we get into the room, there's like 25 people around this big giant conference table. And they said, all right, Steve, what do you think? I said, look, here's what I see in these textbooks. I see this very soft narrative in these textbooks that basically says, let's take Abraham Lincoln. He's born in a log cabin, he became a lawyer, he became president, he ended slavery, he got assassinated, There's nothing in these textbooks that says to teachers or students, like, let me grab you by the lapel and tell you why Abraham Lincoln is different than the Homestead Act and the Gadsden Purchase. Nothing wrong with the Homestead Act. It's a perfectly good act. But let's talk about why there are 200 books written about this man every 25 years. Let's talk about why more has been written about Abraham Lincoln than about any other historical figure with the exception of Jesus Christ. Do you know what I'm saying? So number one is that. There's no real value judgment that's ever made in these textbooks. It's just kind of this soft. Number 2, and I'll use Teddy Roosevelt, one of my favorite historical figures, as an example. The textbooks seem devoid of the personal stories, the personal piece, and I'll use Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, he had already been president. He was running for the presidency again as a member of the Bull Moose Party, third party candidate. He ends up, by the way, splitting the vote with Taft, which gets Woodrow Wilson elected. However, during his campaign, he's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on his way to a campaign speech, when he is quite literally shot by a would-be assassin. He's got his speech in his breast pocket. The bullet goes through the speech, lodges in his chest. His doctors want him to go to the hospital immediately. Roosevelt says, no, I have a speech to give. He goes to this arena. There's 5,000 people in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. No microphone, of course, 1912. And Teddy Roosevelt quite literally says this to the crowd. I would appreciate it if you would keep your side conversations to a minimum. I've just been shot, and my voice is not as strong as it normally is. He proceeds to give a 1 hour and 5 minute speech, discarding one blood-stained page of his manuscript after another as he's speaking, turns to his doctor and says, now I'm ready to go to the hospital. He gets to the hospital. They can't remove the bullet. It's lodged in the muscles of his chest. Teddy worked out a lot. He was proud of his big chest muscles. And so they say, we're going to leave it. We can't get to it. We're going to leave it. And they do. And Teddy dies of natural causes 8 or 9 years later. So I say to these textbook guys, somebody made the decision to leave that story out of your textbook. So you go to Teddy Roosevelt, and he's the environmentalist, the Rough Riders, San Juan Hill, President of the United States. And why did you leave that story out? And I mean, that's a real issue with me. And so the textbook guys, to their credit, listen, they're not stupid people. They're smart people. And he said, we totally agree with you. He said, but look at the back of these textbooks, and you'll see this whole list of advisors. You go to the back of these textbooks, there's maybe 75 or 100 names. And he says, history, more than any other topic, people bring their politics. This is the advisory group. People bring their politics to history. So you'll have conservatives who say, oh, that Teddy Roosevelt story doesn't depict gun owners in a good way. And you'll have liberals who say, we can't put a story about gun violence. So you have Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives coming at these textbook advisory committees, and you end up, as a result, with a very watered-down, vanilla kind of version. My wife was a classroom teacher for 30 years. She's a principal now, 5th grade teacher. And when you are the husband of the 5th grade teacher, you get called in a lot if you're a historian, to do various things. And you cannot refuse, by the way. So you go into the 5th grade. I went into the 5th grade and I did the thing about Lincoln one time. It was around President's Day. I wanted to do a thing about Lincoln. And my wife says, yeah, come on in, I need you to do it. So I start the discussion off with the kids by saying, tell me everything you know about Abraham Lincoln. We'll put it on the board. And of course they tell me he's tall, he wore a hat, he freed the slaves, born in a log cabin, everything you guys know. And so I said to them, and these kids can handle it, they're 10 years old. I said, imagine this. Imagine you're President of the United States. You're managing the Civil War in the early days of the Civil War because your generals are incompetent. And your 9-year-old son dies. Your 9-year-old son dies. Think about the pressure on you. What do you guys think about that? And the kids are just like fascinated with that story. And we talk almost the whole time about Lincoln's personality and all that and where it leads. So at the end of that, right, I go home. About 4 days later, my wife brings home these great thank you notes, right? Kids make them in construction paper, they says thank you with a picture of Lincoln on it. And I read one, I read them all, and I read one from this little girl who I said to my wife, this little girl is going to be a Rhodes Scholar because she's so perceptive. And here's what she said. Dear Mr. Puleo, thank you for coming in and talking to us about Abraham Lincoln. I want you to know that I enjoyed the personal parts more than I enjoyed the history parts. And I thought, wow, of course the personal parts are the history parts, right? This girl has got it. She's got it at the age of 10. So all of that, I think, factors into what's wrong. I think if you have a bad history teacher in high school, you could be scarred for life. It's not, like if you have a bad French teacher or a bad physics teacher, I think you can recover. I've had people come to me and say, I haven't read history for 25 years until I read Dark Tide. Nothing makes me happier than that. Because it is so dynamic and so interesting. And I think the second part of that word is story, right? And I think sometimes we forget that when we teach it. I'm sorry for the long answer. Do you want more?
No,
God, I'm exhausted.
history is like mashed potatoes.
Yeah, it is. Yes, sir.
If Lincoln had not been elected,
Yeah.
say it had been a Seward or Salmon P. Chase, or even the Democratic
Mm.
candidate, would that have postponed the war? do you think?
Yeah, so the question is, if Lincoln was not elected, if it had been a Democrat or a Seward or a Chase or, take your pick at the time, there were lots of possibilities, right? Would that have postponed the war? It's interesting to me. So Lincoln evolves, I think. So clearly his first priority early in his presidency is to preserve the Union at all costs, at any cost. And then later, I think, by about late 1862, mid-1862, as you're heading towards the Emancipation Proclamation, he really does kind of take on this anti-slavery piece as well. They almost become intertwined. I don't know the answer to that. I think Lincoln's determination to keep the Union intact, which essentially meant that you could not secede from the Union without consequences, probably did hasten the attack on Fort Sumter. I mean, there are some people who I think justifiably believe that him restocking, quote unquote, Fort Sumter left the South with no choice but to fire upon it. So, yeah, I think it's a fair point to say, had he not been elected, you may have postponed it. Yeah, I think it is. So, great question. I saw one right here. Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
The way you speak about Lincoln as following the caning makes me think of the book The Swerve, and I'm seeing the swerve in a way.
Yeah.
If the caning had not taken place and Lincoln was elected for whatever reason, then we may not be looking at the Civil War at all. We may not be looking at the assassination. I don't expect you really to answer that, but without the caning, the way you're tracking history over those.
Yeah, I think, so the question is, without the caning, would we not be looking at
Quite the same
trajectory? No, I think we would not be. And first and foremost, it's possible the Republicans would not have been strong enough to win an election in 1860 without the caning. I mean, that is kind of one of my theses. That 1856 election with Vermont, that's a near win, is a stunning result. It shocks the North and the South in 1856. So I can make the argument that the Republicans may not have been strong enough to elect a president in 1860. So there you go. That changes things, right? Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah.
On what the gentleman just made about, is there anything that could have been done? I don't think there's any question, the Civil War is the greatest tragedy in American history.
I think so.
Is there anything that could have been done before or after the caning that could have avoided the war?
So the question is, and the point is that the Civil War is probably the greatest tragedy in American history. I think 690,000 deaths, right? You could certainly make that argument. So is there anything that could have been done before or after to avoid it? So before, I think that is kind of my point, that before you had the possibility of compromise. After, I think it makes compromise almost impossible because the atmosphere is too charged and too heated. I mean, there is this remarkable debate. You had the Southerners after the caning. This whole issue of Northern hypocrisy becomes front and center after the caning. Brooks does it himself in speeches. Many of the Southerners, it's fascinating to read it, do it in speeches. This whole point of Northerners who got rich in the textile business. I mean, Brooks even says, the slavery is the goose that laid the golden egg in the North. Keep that in mind. And the other interesting hypocrisy point that Brooks raises specifically about Sumner after the caning, and other Southerners raise after the caning, is basically this. How dare you, Charles Sumner in Massachusetts, lecture us about how we treat our slaves when thousands of Irish immigrants who are coming to your city live in destitution, poverty, tenements, disease-filled buildings, etc., etc. And I had never seen that debate. I had seen the hypocrisy debate on the textile industry, never had seen the Irish piece of that before this research. So I found that kind of fascinating too. So what I'm saying is the atmosphere is so charged after the caning, north and south. And then you had Brooks's death where the North is aghast at this pilgrimage from Washington, D.C. back to Edgefield. That Brooks is treated as literally a hero, a national hero. So I think that's what I'm saying. I think it's tough after that. I think it's really tough after that. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, Harry Truman, the Democrat, was from Missouri. But it inserted in World War I, say by the 1920s, how would he have felt about all this?
So how would Harry Truman have felt about the caning?
Yeah, the future president.
Well, I don't know.
That's the whole.
You're saying the Missouri situation? I
How
mean,
would he have felt?
I don't know. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, Harry Truman, of course, one of the best read presidents of all time, right? Even though he didn't graduate from college. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't know that I've ever seen how Harry Truman felt about the Missouri Compromise and the issues in Missouri. And you know what? Now I'm kind of curious. That's a good question. Yes, sir.
What was the situation in the rest of the world in terms of slavery?
Yeah. Yeah.
Was there a movement toward it or against it?
Yeah, so great question. Thank you for the question. What was the situation in the rest of the world regarding slavery? So, one of Charles Sumner's big sort of arguments is that most of Europe had abolished slavery by this time. When Sumner went to Europe his first time, not during his recovery, but also during his recovery, he heard from the British, he heard from the French, he heard from the Italians. Why do you still have slavery? It's a barbaric existence, etc., etc. So there was definitely a move afoot. Slavery had ended in those places. Now, the hypocrisy issue continues. Some of the biggest customers of Southern plantation owners happen to be the British, the French, and the Italians. So I want you to keep that in mind as you go forward. But mostly slavery had been abolished. And of course it had been abolished in the North, slave trade in 1808, and then pretty much slavery in general about 1810, 1811, 1812, right around there in the North.
Even the Caribbean.
Well, that triangle trade, the molasses trade, if you will, which was basically northern Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, to some extent Pennsylvania, would send rum to the west coast of Africa. They would send slaves to the West Indies and Puerto Rico and Cuba. They would send molasses back up north, and that cycle would go on. That's what ends about 1808. That's the slave trade that ends about 1808. Slavery continues in the South, and I think this is an important point, and I think it's an important point that the founders would make. Most of the founders during the Constitutional Convention debates believed slavery would die its own death in a fairly short time. What changes that? Let me see if you guys remember from your high school history. This gentleman, this gentleman gets an A. The cotton gin. Poor Eli Whitney in 1793, thinks he's doing a good thing for sort of Southerners and helping people, helping these farmers kind of separate the seed from the flour, et cetera, et cetera. What he succeeds in doing with the cotton gin is increasing the output of a single slave by about a factor of 50. It is the cotton gin that creates big cotton, the sort of cotton economy upon which slavery is based. So pretty interesting how technology links to history often. Here's a case of where that happened. Yeah. Yes, sir.
They needed slaves to plant the rice. There was no machines.
Yeah, and they also did. They needed slaves for rice and indigo. There were many other crops for slaves. But there's no question about it. Without the cotton trade, slavery would not be economically viable in the South. Certainly not to the extent that it was. Yes? Yeah.
I wanted to mention, you mentioned the various monuments to Charles Sumner in Massachusetts, but you haven't mentioned the Sumner Tunnel.
Yeah, so here's another thing I can't talk about in my presentation because I don't have enough time, but I got the question. Thank you. So I mentioned the Sumner statue in Massachusetts, and what about the Sumner Tunnel and all that? So first of all, let's dispel that. The Sumner Tunnel is not named after Charles Sumner. It is named after a general from East Boston who was instrumental in the War of 1812. I forget his first name. But you raise a good question, and you allow me to get to a bigger issue. So Charles Sumner's legacy in Massachusetts, I think, is largely lost, forgotten, subsumed, not where it should be by any way, shape, or form. So the statue in the public garden that was built in the late 1800s, I think 1897, only says Sumner on it. That's all it had to say at the time. He was that big. He was that much of a giant. The word Sumner is all that's needed. Now, Charles Sumner's legacy, I think, is largely, I will say, forgotten. 2 years ago, 2011 was the 200th anniversary of his birth. There were a few efforts to have these various kinds of events, mostly academics and those sort of things. In Boston, I think not only is the sort of Civil War legacy a little bit forgotten, but the Sumner is almost totally forgotten. I think my thesis is if you ask 100 people on Boston Common who was Charles Sumner, you might get 15 people who could tell you. Maybe.
I thought it was the Sumner Tunnel.
Yes, well, aside from the tunnel, but I'm saying, I think you maybe get 15 people. And I think there's a reason for that. I think, and maybe it's not a good reason, but I think kind of Boston prides itself on two main kinds of history, right? Revolutionary history, which justifiably so. So we all know Paul Revere and John Hancock and John Adams, right? And the emergence of the Irish politician. So James Michael Curley and John F. Kennedy, far better known in Boston than Charles Sumner. Far better known. And you could make the argument that Charles Sumner was far more influential than either one of them for that 25-year period in the 19th century. So I find the whole thing kind of fascinating. There is a elementary school either in West Roxbury or Rosendale, I forget now, that is, by the way, the Charles Sumner Elementary School. It is named after him, yes. But it's few and far between. You go to Harvard, there's a statue in the yard. You go to the public garden, there's a statue of him with his coat behind him. But other than that, it's, he's kind of faded, which is very strange to me, very strange. You look at the 19th century, and Charles Sumner is right there with Lincoln, with Ulysses S. Grant, with Andrew Jackson. I mean, he is right there in terms of influence and power and sort of cachet. And then he kind of fades, which is, which is funny. Who hasn't asked? Yes, sir, go ahead.
Yes, this is not so much a question, maybe you can help me with a question.
Sure.
As it is a reaction. I never heard of the cane before. All of this is an enormous revelation to me.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good.
Yes, it is. It was a horrific, barbaric act, and I had two reactions to it. Why was Brooks restrained? How could that be allowed to continue for 90 seconds? How could that actually happen civilized? And the second thing is, Brooks, you said earlier, would not duel Sumner because Sumner was not a gentleman. How about beating someone to an instant life with a wooden cane, being not a genteel or a gentleman? So I'm puzzled by the idolatry that the Southerners showered upon Brooks for that behavior. I mean, we think now, the Southern being, a genteel society.
Mm-hmm.
What the hell was genteel about it?
Yeah, so, all right, so you have a few questions in there, I think. Let me recap. One is, you never heard of this thing, and it's enormously revealing to you, which is great. That's always a good thing, right? Two is, why did nobody try to stop it? Why did nobody come to Sumner's aid? And I'm telling you that one of the reasons was that Charles Sumner was intensely disliked in the Senate by Southerners for sure. He was often called one historian called Charles Sumner the best hated man in the Senate. I love that expression, the best hated man in the Senate. The South, of course, despised him, but many of his northern colleagues found him abrasive, very hard to talk to, humorless, and so there wasn't a great rush. And again, I want to be fair. It's not that the Senate chamber was completely full. They had adjourned. There were a lot of people in the chamber milling around. But I don't want to give the impression it was completely full. But there wasn't this rush to intervene. And surely you can understand some of that. I mean, put yourself in modern times. There's a reluctance of people sometimes to intervene in situations like that. So I'm saying, I don't, there are probably a lot of psychological reasons for it, but I'm giving you kind of my best thinking on the why. And two, this whole Southern Code of Honor, which is a big part of Brooks's upbringing, a big part of who he is, a big part of Edgefield, a big part of the South in general. And you're using the term genteel, which I think is a fine word. It's more of a sense of order. I think I would use that as the point. And why was Brooks idolized when that would seem to fly in the face of kind of a Southern gentleman's reaction? And my answer is this. I think at this point, the South was seeing the abolitionist movement grow in the North, and was seeing the potential beginning of the end of slavery, the potential beginning of the end of its way of life, its economic way of life. And the Brooks being of Sumner kind of unleashes that whole emotional cauldron, if you will, that had been simmering for a very, very long time. I think that's the answer. It's not a real logical reaction. It's kind of why I made the point at the beginning that this was an emotional. This took the debate about slavery into the emotional realm. So,
if Brooks had just shot him to death,
yeah,
instead of nearly beat him to death,
I think it would have been much different. I think you're exactly right. If Brooks had just shot him to death instead of beat him and shattered his cane. And one of the things I neglected to tell in my presentation is Southern congressmen, they pick up splinters of that cane and they have gold-lined rings made, which they wear around their necks on chains in solidarity with Brooks. Those rings, by the way, are at the University of South Carolina Museum, and there are a couple photos in my book. But yes, I think had he shot him, so had he done something to Sumner that was dispassionate, which is what a gunshot is, yes, I think it would have been different. I think you're exactly right. What else? Yes?
About John Brown.
Yeah, John Brown.
Rampage, and he and his sons killed 5 people. Now, how come the North, wasn't there any, this action, they backed him and the North gave him money. Wasn't he held responsible at all? Yeah, so that's a great question. Was John Brown held responsible? Why did the North back him? So let's remember this in the debate over slavery. No one comes out sort of in shining armor here, right? So this whole issue about hypocrisy in the North is very real. So most abolitionists viewed John Brown's actions, I think, as part of a larger cause, as part of the cause to abolish slavery. Lots of rationalizations made by abolitionists as to John Brown's actions. And John Brown's actions, and I do describe this in the book, were gruesome. He takes these men out, literally pulls them out of the house, dismembers some of them. It's a terrible way. They die in terrible ways. And many of the abolitionists view this as kind of part of the cause of the effort. And then, of course, when Brown is captured and hanged after Harper's Ferry, his kind of legend grows. So, history's never tidy, right? It's never, it's always a little bit messy. And I think you've hit on one of the points, that's pretty inconsistent to not hold him accountable. I would agree, yeah. I see Connie's lurking out of my peripheral vision. I can see her lurking. So am I allowed to do one more or no? Okay, she's telling me one. Anytime she's lurking, I have to obey. Yes, sir, go ahead.
I just sort of feel every congressman or senator should be able to speak his piece without fear.
I would agree.
Jefferson Davis did the same thing. He caned somebody. Are there any other episodes since then? No. So, well, there are any other episodes since the caning. Before the caning, there were a number of, and again, a lot of times an event, it depends when the event happens in history, right? So, before the caning, there were a number of skirmishes, mostly on the House side, where, at 2 o'clock in the morning, you'd have like 10 or 15 guys going at it, fighting during debates. It was, I won't say it was common, but it wasn't rare, let me put it to you that way. The caning is magnified because of its moment in history, I think, number one, because of its bloodiness, and sort of the overt, bloodiness of the act, number two, and number three, because of what happens afterwards, I think. So
To my knowledge, post-caning, no, I don't know of any events. And of course, you hit on what the North was most upset about. Even Northerners who did not fall into the Sumner camp, who did not support Sumner, who disliked Sumner, as a matter of fact, had little choice but to support him, and they used as their argument the freedom of speech choice, that a person should be able to say, no matter what they say, they should be able to say it, without being attacked. And so that is how a lot of the more moderates in the North fashioned their argument after the caning. So very astute by you. Okay, now she's really learning.
Steve is going to be at this first table to sign books. Carol and I are going to be at the other table to take your money and write us a receipt from Bookends. And thank you so much for coming. I hope you enjoy it.